Hey guys, sorry I couldn't be here with you today, but I want to keep you from getting behind the other classes, so we're going to do a screencast of the Chapter 10 PowerPoint. So go ahead and get out your notes and get ready to take Chapter 10 notes. This section we're going to be talking about government spending. Last section we talked about government revenue, where the government gets all its money from. This time we're going to talk about what it does once it has all that money, and how it decides what it's going to do with it, and what the effects of government spending actually are. So to start with, let's talk about the two big kinds of government spending. You've got discretionary and then mandatory. This page is going to look a little bit different than your notes. I broke the top part up a little bit. I had it kind of labeled wrong, so just fill it in as I've got it here. So, the two types of spending. The first is in the forms of goods and services. That's what we call discretionary spending. That's where the government buys lots of different goods like tanks, planes, ships, space shuttles. You've got this organization called DARPA, one of my favorites. I love to keep up with them. They make crazy robots, and I'm going to show you a video of those in a minute when we're done with this slide. I've shown you one, the big dog, that creepy four-legged robot that ran around. The one I'm going to show you next is even creepier, so get ready for that. The government also needs office buildings, land for parks, capital goods for schools and laboratories that the government operates. And the government also needs to purchase supplies and pay for utilities. Also, it has to hire people to work for those agencies and to staff the military. And those payments for services are wages or salaries. And those are all parts of the discretionary spending. The second type of spending, mandatory spending, is also known as transfer payments. Those are payments for which the government doesn't receive goods or services in return for it. Basically, it's a transfer of money from the government to another individual who then spends that money on goods and services. And transfer payments are things like Social Security for the elderly, unemployment compensation, welfare, aid to people with disabilities, aid to needy families, food stamps, now known as SNAP benefits. With the exception of the Social Security, people normally receive those payments solely because they need assistance. Social Security is specifically for the elderly. So also, last class we talked about intergovernmental revenue, where the federal government, I called it the allowance. The federal government pays an allowance to the state governments, and the state governments pays money to the local governments. That's actually a form of transfer payment, a form of mandatory spending. It's known as a grant in aid, but you don't need to know that. Just interesting. All right, you don't have this pie chart, but this is one of the most recent ones. This is the proposed mandatory spending pie chart. Shows you what the biggest chunks of government spending are going to. It says proposed spending, even though the budget has already been approved, because who knows what's going to happen, you know. Some war could break out again. Whatever's going on in Russia right now could affect our spending. So it's proposed. You can see Social Security, unemployment, and labor, those are transfer payments, take up the big chunk, 51% of mandatory spending. And Medicare and healthcare take up 36%, and then you've got transportation, veterans benefits, food, and agriculture making up the smaller portions. Here is the discretionary spending, and the big difference between mandatory and discretionary, I should probably explain that, is that mandatory, the government has already set up in the budget that this much money will be set aside for mandatory spending. You have to spend this much on Social Security. You have to spend this much on Medicaid and Medicare. No choice. Discretionary spending is up to the president and his budgetary office. They can decide how much is going to be spent in each area, and then the Congress can approve or disapprove or change however they see fit. So the proposed discretionary spending for 2014, you can see the largest chunk of that, of course, is military spending, as it has been for the past decade because we're involved in 2 wars right now. The second largest chunk is education. You can see the disparity there, 57% for military, 6% for education, 6% for government, 6% veterans benefits, housing and community, healthcare, international affairs, smaller and smaller chunks of the pie. Energy and environment, science, 3%. That makes me sad. Transportation, labor, food, and agriculture gets the smallest chunk. That's those agricultural subsidies that I was telling you guys about. So a very small percentage of the discretionary spending, but it makes a huge difference in how our agricultural products are made. Speaking of, oh, you know what? I didn't show you that video, did I? We'll go back to it later. So how does government spending impact Americans? Well, two ways: resource allocation and the distribution of income. Those are two of the ways. There's more. So for resource allocation, let's say the government decides to spend revenue, to spend tax money on building missile systems out in rural areas, for example, rather than maybe doing social welfare programs in urban areas. When you shift that money from the urban area to the rural area, that's also going to stimulate economic activity in the rural area. There's going to be people moving out there because they want to work for these missile building plants. There's going to be an economic boom in that area since there's more spending going on there, which means that there is not more spending and there's not an economic boom going on in the urban areas where that money could have gone. So resource allocation makes a difference depending on who gets the money, where the resources are going. There's this guns versus butter idea that I explained at the very beginning of the school year, of the semester. Guns being an acronym, or guns being a stand-in for military spending, butter is a stand-in for domestic spending. If our money is being allocated towards the military, as a lot of it is now, then we're not allocating as much money for butter, for domestic spending, for education, for agricultural subsidies, for whatever that money could have gone to help the nation. Instead, it's going outside the nation in the form of military spending. No Child Left Behind is another example of how government involvement in the economy through spending has such an enormous impact on what we produce. So when No Child Left Behind legislation went into effect, the government required schools to conduct extensive testing in reading and math. And because reading and math were so emphasized, some schools reduced the amount of time that they spent on other subjects, or even did away with certain classes altogether. You probably heard about some schools getting rid of PE to make more time for reading and math. Because those subjects became less important to the school, because they weren't being tested, there was a decision to downgrade or even drop other subjects, and eventually you don't need the resources for those subjects either, so the textbooks and even the teachers that used to be necessary for the subjects that were no longer as important, the demand for them went away. And so the production in those areas, people that were going into those areas to work, all that demand went away and they had to go and seek employment elsewhere, and the resources that used to go to making textbooks for those areas went somewhere else as well. So on the distribution of income, government spending influences that. And that is, distribution of income is the way in which income is distributed among families, individuals, and other groups. So increasing or decreasing transfer payments, for example, can have a huge income on needy families who receive financial support from the government, who rely on financial support from the government. Who will build our guns and make our butter? Let's say that the government makes a decision to buy fighter planes from one factory rather than another factory. That's going to have a huge impact on the communities near both factories. The one that gets the government money is going to have an economic increase. The one that doesn't is probably going to have an economic decrease. Maybe that factory will go out of business and all those people will lose their jobs. So where the government chooses to spend its money can have a huge impact on people's lives. Another area of impact, competition with the private sector. So the government produces its own goods and services that it sells to us. And often when the government produces those goods and services, it's directly in competition with the private sector. So in higher education and colleges, many public colleges and universities are competing with more expensive private colleges and universities. The cost difference is due to the subsidies that public institutions are receiving from the state. So the government's paying them money to support those schools. In the area of healthcare with hospitals, the government, let's say it runs a system of hospitals for military veterans, and those are funded with taxpayer dollars. And at the same time, those military hospitals are directly competing with hospitals in the private sector that offer similar services. So the government is competing, public sector competing with private sector. Finally, on increasing the tax burden, when the government spends more money, it has to have more money to spend, so it has to increase where it gets its money. And as you know, the government gets most of its money from us in the form of taxes. So the increased tax burden is something that Americans have definitely felt. Most people would love to have their taxes reduced, but most people are also reluctant to give up all those benefits that they get from the government. So that makes it difficult for the Senate, for the Congress, to make decisions about how to get more money and also how to spend the money that they do have. All right, let's talk about how the federal government spends its money. Let's talk about how the federal government decides how to spend its money first. We'll talk a little bit about budgeting. You may remember this year the problems getting the president's budget to pass through because the Senate kept disapproving of parts of it. So what the federal budget is an annual plan that outlines the proposed revenues, so the money that comes in, and the proposed expenditures, how the money goes out for a coming year. The federal budget is a rough estimate of the amount of money that's going to come in and also the amount of money that's going to be spent. We don't really ever know how much money we're going to spend because things change in the world very quickly. I mean, a couple months ago we were celebrating the Olympics in Russia, and now we're watching Russia take over parts of the Ukraine. So things change very rapidly in our world, and that can have a huge impact on how much we decide that we're going to be spending. But let's talk about the budget. So, we have a thing called a fiscal year, which is a 12-month financial planning period, and it may or may not coincide with the calendar year. The government's fiscal year usually starts October 1st and it ends on September 30th. And now the president has an Office of Management and Budget, and their job is to prepare the federal budget. But remember, the president's budget is a request. Congress has to approve it, or they can modify it, or they can outright disprove it. So what happens first? The president and his Office of Management and Budget come up with a budget, and they send that to the House. The House of Representatives receives the president's budget request, and then it breaks down that budget plan into 13 major areas of spending. And they assign each one of those 13 major categories of spending to a separate House committee. And those committees get together and they discuss and they vote. They have debates and hearings, and they vote on their section of the budget. If they approve it, then it's sent to the entire House for a vote. So the subcommittees send their section to the entire House. Now, if they approve it there, then they send it on to the Senate, and the Senate acts on the budget after the House approves it. The Senate can approve the bill, they can draft their own version of it, they have choices in how they can change what the House decided to do with it, and then they pass it on. If the House and the Senate both approve, then they send that on to the president for the signature. But because Congress literally has taken the entire bill apart, the entire budget apart, rewrote it, put it back together, it might not look anything like what the president had originally submitted to them. So the president might veto it. He might deny the bill passage. And then he'll send it right back to Congress, and then they have to start the whole process over again. Eventually, though, if it gets back to the president and he approves of it, he'll sign it and it'll become law. All right, this is what a budget looks like. You can see this FY stands for fiscal year 14, president request. These numbers here are in billions. These are billions of dollars. How many billions of dollars are we going to be sending to these different organizations that are abbreviated over here? Like the National Security, Department of Education, Department of Defense, National Aeronautics and Space Association, National Institutes of Healthcare. They are broken down into these sections, and the government, the Congress, is debating on the amount of money to approve for each one of these sections separately. Okay, now that we talked about how they set up spending, or how they decide how much to spend, let's talk about how they actually spend. So if you recall from that pie chart earlier, the biggest chunk of mandatory spending is Social Security. Social Security is the largest payment that the government pays out mandatory spending, and it is to aged and disabled Americans, and that's through the Social Security program. Retired persons receive benefits through Social Security. It's like a pension. And the biggest chunk of discretionary spending is in defense expenditures. And that spending, discretionary means it has to be approved by Congress in the annual budgetary process. Oops, I pushed the wrong button. Salaries, benefits for federal workers, that money goes to people who work for the federal government, obviously, military and civilian. Medicare, a healthcare program available to all senior citizens regardless of income. We started that in 1966, and that's again another mandatory program. It provides an insurance plan that covers, major hospital costs and stuff like that for the elderly. I talked to you before about how Medicare expenditures have risen dramatically in the last couple of years because our population is getting older as the baby boomers retire. And as we have more and more elderly, the cost of caring for the elderly goes up exponentially. Given that we have an increasing cost of medicine and an increasing aging population, we can expect Social Security and Medicare to rise as a chunk of our mandatory expenditures every year for a very long time to come. Medicare, that is, again, healthcare for the elderly. Medicaid, healthcare for the low-income families. Interest on debt. The federal government spends more money than it collects in taxes. That goes to the debt when you spend more than what you have. And the government has to borrow money to make up for that difference. So we'll borrow money from ourselves, from other countries, to pay that difference in the debt. The government has to pay interest on the debt. We don't usually pay off the balance. In fact, we haven't paid off the balance in a very long time. So we just pay the interest on that debt. And paying off the interest currently makes up the 6th largest category of federal spending. So even though we're only paying the interest, it's a big chunk. Some other stuff that the government spends money on, education, training employees, social services, transportation, veterans benefits, natural resources, environment, and that's both mandatory and discretionary spending. So that falls under both categories. All right, how the states spend money. The largest category of state spending is that intergovernmental revenue, those grant and aid programs where they pay money to counties, cities, and towns. Public welfare is the second largest category of state spending. That can be cash assistance to needy families, payments for medical care, spending to maintain welfare institutions, and other expenditures on welfare. Salaries and benefits for state employees, you have to pay your employees, and state employees do get a good amount of benefits. Other stuff the government spends on, higher education, electricity, gas, water, hospitals, parks and recreation, highways, road improvements, all those are paid for by the state government. All right, the way local governments spend money. Local governments, those include your counties, parishes, towns, municipalities, tribal councils, school districts, and a couple other special districts. That's what makes up the local government. Their biggest chunk of spending is elementary and secondary education. Remember, the state does more for the higher education, and then there's a private institution as well. What they pay for as far as education goes, administrators and teachers' salaries, wages for maintenance, cafeteria workers, textbooks, other supplies, and construction and upkeep of school buildings. Schools account for more than 1/3 of all local government spending, so it is definitely the largest item in a local budget, which is why people argue about it so much. Utilities. Public utilities serve communities by providing services. We have sewage, electricity, natural gas, water, all those are public utilities. And for most local governments, that is the second largest expenditure. It consumes about 10% of a local budget. Lots of money goes to utilities. Public safety and health. Sorry, I had a mess up there. On public safety and health, most communities maintain a full-time paid police force. Many have fire departments with paid full-time firefighters. Some communities, especially larger cities, own and staff their own hospitals. And spending on those categories varies greatly from one state to another. It depends on how large, or on one local government to another. It depends on how large the local government is. Some other expenditures: highways, roads, and street repairs absorb most of the remaining spending. That's like repair of potholes, installation, repair of street signs, snow removal, other street-related items, stuff like that. I'm sure you guys heard all about the how angry people were about how slow it was to remove the snow in this area. Well, we don't have that much in the way of snow removal machinery because we're not used to having as much snow as we've had this year. So maybe that'll change next year because we did have so much snow this year. All right, let's talk about deficits and debts. I'm sure we're curious about this since it's so in the news lately. There's a big difference between a deficit and a debt. A deficit is when you spend in excess of the revenue collected. It's when you spend more money than you have. Debt is when you borrow money from somebody else. In our case, we borrow money so we can make up for our deficit spending. So deficits occur for a number of reasons. For one thing, tax reductions are politically popular. People don't like to pay high taxes. Politicians want to curry favor with people, and so they lower taxes to claim they'll lower taxes. But people are also in favor of government spending more money on them. People like the government benefits that they can receive. Also, expenses such as war and natural disaster are difficult or impossible to predict sometimes, and that can take a big chunk of budget as well. So if something very terrible happens, and we have to spend a lot of money to fix that problem, that might drive us into deficit on its own, even if we've been really careful about bringing in just as much money as we planned on spending. The national debt, the total amount borrowed by the government. We owe quite a bit of money. Fortunately for us, most of that money is owed to ourselves, which we'll hear more about in a minute. This is the current national debt. Actually, this was the current national debt of about 4 weeks ago. Let's see what it is now. See if we take it to the website. Yes, here we go. This is our current U.S. national debt. So it's gone up even since I last put this in. So it's currently $17,577,255,000 and counting. This clock over here is the debt per citizen. So if we took our national debt and broke it up by the number of individuals that live in the country, 317 million, that would be how much each individual person owes. So 317 million people, that's every man, woman, child, old person, person who doesn't work. Debt per taxpayer, we've got about 140 million people in our labor pool, so if you work, this is what your portion of the national debt looks like. This right here is the U.S. federal spending and our U.S. federal budget deficit. So this is how much more money we're spending than we've brought in revenue, 625 billion plus. Underneath here, you can actually see the budget items. You can see the cost of Medicaid and Medicare, the cost of Social Security, our current spending on war. So even though that was a huge chunk of the discretionary spending pie, it's still not as much as we're spending on Medicaid and Medicare. So, interesting little clock. If you ever want to go look at that in more depth, usdebtclock.org. Easy to get to. Okay. A balanced budget, that's something that we have not seen in a very long time, but a balanced budget is when expenditures are equal to revenue. When the amount of money that you spend equals the amount of money that you bring in. We haven't seen that since about the 90s. And that was a very brief time period. Talk a little bit about who owns the debt. I told you guys already that a good portion, this is a little out of date now, it's about 12 trillion is owned by us, 17 trillion is the national debt. About 11 trillion of that is owned by public or federal agencies or private citizens in the form of treasury bills, notes, and bonds. I explained briefly to you what bonds are. We'll get way more into that in the next unit, so I'm not going to bother right now. After us, we owe the next largest amount to China, about 1.27 trillion. Then to Brazil, surprisingly enough. Then Japan, and then the United Kingdom. And there's a bunch of other little ones underneath there. You should also remember, though, that those countries owe us a lot of money as well. We're all very intertangled by our borrowing. That's one thing that keeps us out of wars with each other, because we owe each other a lot of money. How does this debt affect us? What impact does that national debt have on us? Well, accumulation of debt by one generation can affect subsequent generations through something called the transfer of purchasing power. So in general, when public debt increases, and public debt is what we're talking about here, the national debt, taxes have to increase as well in order to pay down that debt. If taxes increase, that means people have less money to spend on themselves. That's one example of a transfer of purchasing power. We lose some of our money power. Purchasing power can also be transferred from one generation to another. Let's say the government borrows money today, and then we leave that debt to our children, our future taxpayers. Then today's adults are going to consume more goods than their children are going to be able to, because their children are going to be responsible for that large debt. Lots of borrowing from the government can cause interest rates to go up, which in turn makes it difficult for citizens to borrow money. What that means is when the federal government uses deficit spending, it has to borrow money in financial markets. Remember that interest rates are the cost of borrowing money. As the government borrows more and more money, the demand for that money goes up, which causes the interest rates to go up as well. And that forces all borrowers, anyone who wants to borrow money, to have to pay more money in order to borrow. So people that want to get a mortgage for a house, people that want to take out a loan to start a small business, they're going to find that the cost of borrowing money goes up so much that they may not be able to borrow that money. They may not be able to buy a home or to start a business. That's called the crowding out effect, when the government crowds people out of a certain market with its sheer size and buying power. Lastly, if taxes are changed to pay down the debt, families in different tax brackets can be hurt. That's called the redistribution of income. Suppose, let's say, for example, that the government taxes upper income individuals, so higher earning individuals, and they spend that money on the poor in the form of transfer payments. That would redistribute the income from the rich to the poor, and the opposite would happen if the poor were taxed and money spent on the rich. In either case, we are hurting people in different tax brackets by changing taxes as a way of paying down the debt. It doesn't matter which families we're taking the taxes away from, we're taking money away from them, and that's going to hurt them. Right, I have another video for you guys to watch. This is the guy that does the crash course in world history. You've probably seen a couple of his videos. He talks fast, but he has a lot of really good information, so I want you to hear what he has to say about the impact of national debt. So listen closely.
So one of the biggest issues in global politics these days is government debt and deficits, which is a particularly big deal in the United States because of the presidential campaign and also because of the looming fiscal cliff. At Hague, as you'll no doubt remember, I received a bronze medal in economics at the 1994 Alabama State Academic Decathlon, meaning that in 1994 I was the third best 17-year-old economist among all C students in the state of Alabama. So not to brag or anything, but I'm pretty qualified to explain this stuff. Okay, so first we have to separate the ideas of debt and deficit. Debt is the total amount of our outstanding liabilities. Deficit, or occasionally surplus, is the difference between what the government spends and what it takes in. Right, so in the United States, our current national debt is around $16 trillion, which sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But let's break this down. The largest single holder of U.S. government debt is actually the federal government itself, because trust funds like Social Security buy government bonds, and so the interest goes from the U.S. government to a different part of the U.S. government, which is not borrowing as we usually imagine it. So if you take away that money, you're left with about $11 trillion, which is still a fair bit of cash. Who owns that debt? China, you probably guessed. But in fact, no. The plurality of that debt is actually owned by us being American individuals and institutions. China owns about 8% of our debt, Japan 7%, and the UK 1%. But it's important to note that the U.S. also owns foreign debt, including about $235 billion of sovereign debt in China and Hong Kong. about like a family owing money to a credit card company, because in that situation, the family owes money to someone else. But in the case of U.S. government debt, we mostly indirectly or directly owe money to ourselves. So our national debt is a very large number, but at least at the moment, it is not a very large problem. Like in 2011, we paid about 3% total interest on our debt. In 2012, it will be even less because our debt is incredibly cheap right now. I mean, heck, in some ways, it is literally cheaper than free. Right now, the yield on a one-year treasury bond is 0.17%. Okay, two very important things to note about the debt. First, China can't, like, call in our debt on a day of its choosing. If I buy a $100 one-year treasury bond today, I'm going to get that $100 back along with my 17 cents in interest in 1 year. I can't call after a month and be like, give me my money back. So despite what you hear from a lot of political commentators, that is not really a risk to the U.S. economy. Secondly, you may have heard people say the government should be run like a business. It should never spend more than it takes in. Yeah, no, that is not how businesses are run. Like, say that tomorrow I invent a Marty McFly hovercraft skateboard. In that situation, I wouldn't wait 20 years until I'd sold enough DFTBA posters to build my Marty McFly hoverboard factory. I would just borrow the money and build the factory immediately so I could start selling hoverboards and swim in a sea of $100 bills. Actually, I would not swim in a sea of $100 bills. I would hoverboard over that sea. Businesses spend more than they bring in all the time. As well they should, and almost all economists agree that governments are similar. There are times when they need to run deficits. For instance, during a recession, government revenue goes down because wages stagnate and unemployment goes up, but government expenditures have to go up, like on unemployment benefits, for instance. So just to be clear, deficits are not inherently evil, and our current debt, while it is very large, does not pose a threat to the American economy because we can pay it back with relative ease. I mean, it's not going to be free, but it's going to be like 2% of GDP. We've done it before. However, there is a huge future risk to us because what if our debt stopped being cheap? What if people stop believing that the U.S. is the safest place to put their money and they start to buy bonds in, I don't know, like Brazil or China or Germany? Well, that would be very bad because most years we run a budget deficit, and so we would need to keep borrowing money at these higher interest rates, which would necessitate more deficits and therefore more borrowing at progressively higher interest rates. And then we'd have to cut spending, which would slow growth, and raise taxes, which would slow growth more, and then Greece. Except this might actually be much worse for us than it's been for Greece because the U.S. enjoys all kinds of benefits from having the world's most trusted currency. Like, hey, believe it or not, most U.S. paper currency actually circulates outside the U.S., and that's very helpful for us in terms of exchange rates and keeping our debt cheap. And if we lost that, it would be devastating because we would just be a regular country again. Okay, so the federal deficit in 2011 was about 1.3 trillion. It'll be down a little bit this year to about $1 trillion. It'll be down further in 2013, no matter who is president, to about 900 billion. But most people think that number needs to continue to come down, or at some point we are going to risk these spiraling higher interest rates. So there are two ways of doing this. The first is to print more money, like, oh, we need $100 billion to close the deficit. Look, I just made $100 billion using a printing press. That sounds like a fine idea, except that it will lead to inflation. Now, a lot of people in comments will be saying that we should just return to the gold standard, which I think is a very bad idea for the reasons I explained in the doobly-doo. However, in the broadest sense, our currency is already pegged to goods and services because if the amount of money in the world doubled tomorrow, the amount of stuff wouldn't. So you can imagine what would happen to the cost of everything. It would double. The second and better way to cut the deficit is to close the gap between what we take in and what we spend. And in times of economic expansion, this is actually quite easy because the tax base grows and the amount of money people make goes up, so they pay more taxes, so we can just have surpluses, as we did in the 1990s. But during slow recoveries, like the one we have right now, it is much more complicated. So like both President Obama and Governor Romney favored unspecified spending cuts, Governor Romney also favors a tax cut of 20% across the board, whereas President Obama thinks that we should increase taxes by rolling back the Bush-era tax cut on income over $250,000. Neither of these plans is likely to eliminate the deficit, although again, the deficit doesn't necessarily need to be eliminated, and no matter what political rhetoric you hear, neither of these plans is terribly radical either. President Obama wants to put the top marginal income tax rate at 39%. It was over 50% every year from 1945 until 1986. Mitt Romney wants to cut that tax rate to 28.5%, which is where it was in 1989. We can argue thoughtfully about what our policy position should be, but amid all the rhetoric and decontextualized statistics, I just want to underscore that while deficit reduction is important, it is not a crisis. The whole idea here is to keep it from becoming a crisis, and one of the best ways to do that is to understand the problem without yelling about it, to discuss things honestly without assuming that the people who disagree with you hate America. Hank, I'll see you on Friday. P.S. Friendly reminder, educational videos are allowed to be over 4 minutes. I'm still working on my punishment, sorry.
Okay. So, like I said, talks really fast, a lot of good information. And a little out of date because that was from 2012. Either way. So let's talk about what he was talking about in that last part there about how to reduce the deficit, how to reduce the debt that we have, and then reduce the deficits that we have every year. The debt accumulates over a series of years. The deficits have been accumulating each budgetary year. So, these three things, the pay-as-you-go, line item veto, and spending caps, are actually failures. The government attempted to do these things to try and close the deficit and the debt, but these different projects failed. So let's look at some of the failures of Congress. The pay-as-you-go provision. That was passed in 1990, and it was a requirement that new spending proposals or tax cuts must be offset by reductions somewhere else in the budget. So if you want to spend money, if you had a plan that you wanted to spend money on something, you had to take money away from some other area of the budget to keep it balanced. Congress soon discovered that cutting spending was a lot harder than they thought it was going to be, and so they suspended that provision in order to increase spending. The problem was people don't like not having money spent on them. So they came up in 1996 with this new idea called the line item veto, and that was the power of the president to cancel specific budget items without rejecting the entire budget. So when Congress sent the president a budget to approve, to sign, if he didn't like certain things, he could cancel very specific areas instead of having to cancel the entire budget altogether. The Supreme Court decided that was unconstitutional. It was too much power to the president, and so that was scrapped as well. Then in 1997, they came up with something called spending caps, legal limits on annual discretionary spending. So remember, the discretionary spending is the one where the government can choose how much it wants to spend on what different areas, as opposed to mandatory. They thought Congress could use this to balance the budget by 2002. However, the caps required politically unpopular cuts in a lot of area programs such as health, science, and education. And so Congress abandoned that as well because it made them unpopular with people, which means they weren't going to get reelected, and they didn't like that very much. So these three items were failures in attempts to balance the budget. What we came up with, and the two best ways that we think that we can solve the budget crisis, is by raising more revenue in the form of taxes and then reducing spending this sounds really simple, but reducing spending in areas where it's not as necessary. But deciding what's necessary and what's not necessary is very difficult in and of itself. So, in the end, Congress has a really difficult task ahead. Any action to reduce budget deficits and the national debt is going to depend on the willpower of our Congress to make unpopular and very difficult decisions that might affect their careers as politicians. Okay, that is the end of that PowerPoint. I do want to go ahead and show you the video from the very first slide, the DARPA robot they're coming up with now. This is an android. It's called Petman. And that's actually a robot in camouflage. I'll show you what he looks like in a minute, so don't be confused. That's not a person. Okay, the next thing that you guys are going to do is you're going to be given a vocabulary worksheet. You'll need to get a textbook off the shelf, and you will go through chapter 10 and look for the bolded words and fill in the blanks of the vocabulary sheet. When you finish with that in the textbook, I want you to go to page 283 and answer question 2. What is the difference between the national debt and the federal debt? And after that, you'll turn in your paper to the sub, and you'll be done for the day. And I will see you guys on Wednesday.